The air in the mahogany-panelled office of Thorne and Associates was thick with the scent of old leather and fresh grief. But for Eleanor Sterling, it was thick only with humiliation. They said her husband, the real estate magnate, Richard Sterling, was worth over $900 million. For 25 years, she had been the perfect corporate wife, the silent partner, the elegant hostess. And now she sat listening to his last will and testament, a final love letter to his legacy, and a final brutal insult to her. The lawyer's voice was a monotone drone, but one phrase cut through the fog. "And to my wife, Eleanor, I leave the sum of $10,000. A gasp rippled through the room. But what no one knew, not the sneering young fiancé, not the corporate lawyers, not even Eleanor herself, was that Richard's greatest trick wasn't in the millions he left behind, but in the billions he had hidden. And the key to it all was sitting right there in the one name he thought he could control forever hers. The Sterling penthouse on Park Avenue wasn't a home. It was a statement. It occupied the top 2 floors of a limestone monolith with floor-to-ceiling windows that didn't just overlook Central Park, they commanded it. Every surface was either Italian marble, polished chrome, or exotic wood that smelled faintly of lemon oil and money. This was the world Richard Sterling had built, and Eleanor Vance Sterling was its most prized and most neglected ornament. Their marriage 25 years ago had been a merger. He was the brash, ambitious developer, clawing his way up from a working-class background in Queens. She was the quiet cerebral art history graduate from a respectable, albeit not wealthy Boston family. He saw her as class, a touch of old-world grace to soften his ruthless edges. She, in her youthful naivete, had seen a diamond in the rough, a man of ferocious energy she mistook for passion. Over the years, the diamond had been polished, but it had also hardened. Richard became a titan of New York real estate. Sterling Tower, Sterling Plaza. The Sterling residences, his name was etched in steel and glass across the city skyline. And with every new acquisition, every billion-dollar deal, a piece of the man Eleanor had married, chipped away, replaced by an insatiable, cold ambition. Their life became a meticulously curated performance. Dinners were not for conversation, but for cementing deals. Vacations were not for relaxing, but for networking in St. Bart's or Monaco. Eleanor played her part flawlessly. She remembered the names of board members' wives, knew which charities to support for maximum social impact, and could host a gala for 500 people without a single flower being out of place. But in the quiet moments, the silence in their cavernous apartment was deafening. Richard rarely spoke to her about his business anymore. In the early days, he would spread blueprints across the dining table, his eyes alight with excitement. Now business was conducted in hushed phone calls behind the closed door of his study. When she asked, he would pat her hand condescendingly. "Don't you worry your pretty head about it, Ellie. Just tell me the caterer for the fundraiser is the best." He controlled everything. Her credit card statements were reviewed by his accountant. The driver reported her destinations. He even suggested her friends, subtly phasing out anyone he deemed too independent or inquisitive. Eleanor, a woman who could once debate the nuances of Renaissance art for hours, found her world shrinking until it was contained within the gilded walls of their penthouse. The final crack in their pristine facade arrived in the form of Amber Croft. She was 28, with a law degree she barely used, and an ambition that rivaled Richard's own. He hired her as a special consultant for his international acquisitions. Soon she was everywhere. At his side in board meetings, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes at dinner parties, her hand lingering on his arm a fraction too long. She looked at Richard with a rapacious hunger that he mistook for adoration. She saw a king, and she wanted the crown. Eleanor saw it all. She saw the way Richard's chest puffed out when Amber praised him. She saw the secret shared smiles across a crowded room. She wasn't angry, not anymore. The part of her that could feel that fiery betrayal had been numbed by years of quiet neglect. What she felt was a profound, weary sadness. The end came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. It was a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was arranging flowers in the foyer when Richard emerged from his study, impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit. "Eleanor," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We need to talk." They sat in the formal living room, a space so perfect it looked like no one had ever lived in it. "I've instructed my lawyer, Marcus Thorne, to draw up divorce papers," he stated, as if discussing a quarterly report. "I think it's for the best. We've grown apart." Eleanor simply stared at him. "Grown apart? Or have you simply found a newer model, Richard?" A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He hated being so transparent. "Amber is a dynamic and brilliant woman. She understands my world." The implication hung heavy in the air. "You do not." "I see," she said, her voice a quiet whisper. "I'll be generous, of course," he continued, waving a dismissive hand. "You'll be very comfortable. We'll release a joint statement about amicable differences. It's all been handled." He stood up, adjusting his tie. He looked at his Patek Philippe watch. "I have a meeting. Marcus will be in touch with your lawyer. Just be sensible about this, Ellie." And with that, he walked out of the room, out of the apartment, and out of her life. Eleanor sat there for a long time, the scent of the white lilies she was arranging suddenly cloying and funereal. He hadn't just ended their marriage. He had liquidated it. Richard Sterling did not do things by halves. His divorce from Eleanor was as public and brutal as his corporate takeovers. His PR team painted a narrative for the tabloids, the dynamic, forward-looking billionaire held back by a staid, old-fashioned wife. They leaked photos of him and a radiant Amber Croft on a yacht in the Mediterranean, while anonymous sources whispered about Eleanor's unreasonable demands. Eleanor, guided by her lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Sarah Jenkins, remained silent. She wanted a quiet, dignified exit, but Richard wouldn't allow it. He fought her on every asset, claiming everything was a product of Sterling Properties, a corporate entity, not marital property. The Park Avenue penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the art collection she had so lovingly curated, he claimed it all. He offered her a settlement that was in the context of his vast wealth, a pittance. It was enough to live comfortably, but it was designed to be a public slap in the face. Sarah Jenkins fought valiantly, but Richard's legal team, led by the formidable Marcus Thorne, was an army. They buried them in paperwork, delayed hearings, and bled Eleanor's resources dry. Then, just 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the unthinkable happened. Richard Sterling, a man who seemed too powerful and vital to ever succumb to mortal weakness, had a massive heart attack on his private jet while flying back from Dubai with Amber. He was dead at 62. The news was a global phenomenon. Financial markets fluttered. Tributes poured in from world leaders and business moguls. And Eleanor, who was now living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, felt a confusing mix of shock and a strange, hollow relief. The fight was over. The reading of the will was scheduled 2 weeks later. Eleanor almost didn't go. "What's the point, Sarah?" she asked her lawyer over the phone. He made his feelings perfectly clear during the divorce. "You have to. Sarah insisted. "You were his wife for 25 years. You need to be there for your own closure to see the final chapter close. Don't let them erase you." So she went. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to Amber Croft, who was positioned next to Richard's older brother, looking every bit the grieving widow in a dramatic black veil and couture dress. The room was filled with Sterling Properties board members, distant family, and a few charity representatives. The air crackled with tension and whispered speculation. Marcus Thorne, his face a grim mask of professionalism, began to read. The will was a testament to Richard's ego. Millions were left to his alma mater, to museums that would name wings after him, and to various foundations that would carry the Sterling name into perpetuity. Generous but calculated bequests were made to his brother and a few loyal executives. Then came the main event. "To my beloved fiancée, Amber Croft." Thorne read his voice unwavering. "I bequeath the entirety of my controlling interest in Sterling Properties, its subsidiaries and all associated assets, including the penthouse apartment at 740 Park Avenue, the estate in Southampton, and my complete art collection." A collective, barely audible intake of breath swept the room. Amber, behind her veil, managed a delicate theatrical sob. She was now, for all intents and purposes, one of the wealthiest women in the world. Thorne cleared his throat and looked down at the final page. "And finally," he said, his eyes flicking towards Eleanor for a fraction of a second, "a personal addendum from Mrs. Sterling." He picked up a separate, smaller envelope and read from a single sheet of paper written in Richard's own aggressive scrawl. "And to my former wife, Eleanor Vance Sterling, who never understood the effort or the genius it took to build my empire, but who certainly enjoyed its comforts, I leave the sum of $10,000. May it help you to finally learn the value of a dollar." The silence that followed was more damning than any shout. It was a silence filled with pity, with scorn, with the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the gesture. Eleanor felt every eye in the room on her. She saw the smirk Amber couldn't quite hide behind her veil. She felt the color drain from her own face, leaving a cold, numb sensation in its wake. $10,000. After 25 years of her life, that was his final valuation of her. She didn't storm out. She didn't cry. With a poise that she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor stood up, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Sarah, and walked out of the room. The clicks of her heels on the marble floor were the only sound, each one a hammer blow to her shattered pride. Her humiliation was now complete, witnessed and sealed by the last will and testament of the man she had once loved. The weeks following the will reading were a blur of grey. The story was, of course, leaked to the press. "Sterling's final rebuke, tycoon leaves ex-wife pennies," screamed one headline. Eleanor became a public object of pity, a cautionary tale whispered about at charity luncheons she no longer attended. Old friends, the society friends who had revolved around Richard's son, stopped calling. Their invitations were contingent on proximity to power, and Eleanor was now powerless. She moved out of the rental apartment she could no longer afford and found a small one-bedroom walk-up in Brooklyn's Carroll Gardens. It was a world away from Park Avenue. The floors creaked, the radiator hissed, and the view was of a brick wall. For the first month, she barely left. The $10,000 check sat on her kitchen counter, an object of such profound insult, she couldn't bring herself to cash it. Her world had been reduced to 4 small rooms. The woman who had managed a staff of 12 now struggled to figure out the temperamental washing machine in the building's basement. The woman who had dined at Le Bernardin now ate toast for dinner, because she was too exhausted to cook. It was in this crucible of loneliness and anonymity that Eleanor Vance finally began to re-emerge from the shadow of Eleanor Sterling. One rainy afternoon, overwhelmed by the oppressive silence, she opened a box that had been in storage for years. Inside were her old college textbooks on art history. She ran her fingers over the faded covers, the smell of old paper and ink, a ghost from a life she had almost forgotten. She pulled out a book on the Dutch masters and began to read. It started as an escape, a way to fill the empty hours, but slowly it became something more. She reread her old essays, her notes scribbled in the margins. She remembered the passion she had felt, the thrill of deciphering the hidden symbolism in a Vermeer or the emotional turmoil in a Rembrandt. A part of her that had been dormant for a quarter of a century began to stir. She started visiting museums again, not as a patron for a gala, but as a student. She would spend hours in front of a single painting at the Met or the Frick collection, a notebook in hand, losing herself in the brush strokes. She was no longer Mrs. Sterling, a name that opened doors. She was just Eleanor Vance, an anonymous woman in a sensible coat, finding solace in the quiet, timeless beauty of art. One day she cashed the check, not out of defeat, but out of pragmatism. It paid for 3 months' rent and a new laptop. With the laptop, she started writing again. She started a small blog, Vance's Vision, where she wrote detailed essays on art exhibits, historical context, and artistic theory. Her writing was sharp, insightful, and deeply personal. It found a small but dedicated audience of art lovers and students. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. It was during this time that Sarah Jenkins, her lawyer, called. "Eleanor, how are you holding up?" Sarah's voice was warm with genuine concern. "I'm okay, Sarah. I'm surviving," Eleanor replied, a hint of her old self returning. "I've been going over the divorce settlement paperwork again," Sarah said, her tone shifting to business. "And some of the corporate filings from over the years. There's something that's been bothering me." "What is it?" Eleanor asked, not with any hope, but with mild curiosity. "During your marriage, Richard had you sign dozens, maybe hundreds of documents. Spousal consent forms, power of attorney for specific transactions, things like that. You remember?" "Vaguely," Eleanor admitted. "He would just put a stack in front of me and say, 'Sign here, Ellie, it's for a bank loan,' or 'It's for a new property title.' I never read them. I trusted him." "I know. Most spouses in your position do," Sarah said. "But I've been looking at the names of the entities you were signing for. Most are standard subsidiaries of Sterling Properties. But there are a few outliers. Companies I can't find any public link to Sterling. One name in particular keeps cropping up over and over again for the last 15 years. A chill went down Eleanor's spine, an inexplicable sense of dread and premonition. "What's the name?" "It's a holding company," Sarah said, her voice slow and deliberate. "It's called Vance Holdings, Inc." Vance, her own maiden name. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness gripping the edge of her small kitchen table to steady herself. "Vance Holdings. I've never heard of it. I've never owned a company." "According to these documents, you do," Sarah said, the sound of rustling papers audible through the phone. "Or at least you are the sole listed director and signatory. Richard set it up 15 years ago. You signed the incorporation papers. You signed documents giving you signatory power over its bank accounts. You signed authorizations for dozens of transactions in its name." Eleanor's mind raced back through the years. She pictured Richard standing over her desk, a sheaf of papers in one hand, an expensive pen in the other. his impatient sigh. "It's just legal boilerplate, Ellie. For tax purposes. You know I handle all this." And she would sign her elegant signature flowing across the page, never once questioning, never once reading the fine print. The trust she'd had in him felt like a monumental, crushing stupidity. What? What kind of company is it, Sarah? That's the $1,000,000 question, or maybe the $1,000,000,000 one? Sarah replied, a new edge of excitement in her voice. On the surface, it's just a shell corporation, registered in Delaware. Minimal public records, but the transaction authorizations you signed, they aren't small. They are for the purchases of very specific, very high-value assets. A commercial building on Fifth Avenue, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, a collection of impressionist paintings purchased at a private auction in Geneva. Eleanor sank into a chair. The Monet, the Degas. Richard told me a corporate partner bought those for the Sterling Properties collection. They weren't bought by Sterling Properties, Sarah said, her voice firm. They were bought by Vance Holdings. Eleanor, legally, they were bought by you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal deep diving. Sarah hired a forensic accountant, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Peterson. Together in Sarah's small office, they began to piece together the puzzle. It was like chasing a ghost through a labyrinth of corporate law. Richard had been brilliant. Vance Holdings was just the beginning. It was the parent company for other smaller entities, all cleverly named to be innocuous. EV Investments, the Vance Trust. Each one was a separate legal entity, a firewalled container for a specific set of assets. They discovered a pattern. Sterling Properties. The public-facing empire Richard had left to Amber was a giant, but it was a giant encumbered with enormous debt leverage and complex financial obligations. It was the working part of his fortune, constantly in flux, vulnerable to market downturns and lawsuits. But the assets placed in the Vance-named companies were different. They were pristine, prime real estate with no mortgages, a stock portfolio worth hundreds of millions, completely unleveraged. Art and jewelry collections that were the envy of the world. These were his crown jewels, the solid, unshakable core of his wealth. He had systematically siphoned off the purest profits from his empire for over a decade and tucked them away into this shadow structure. It's a classic asset protection scheme, Peterson explained, pointing to a complex flowchart they had drawn on a whiteboard. He was terrified of a hostile takeover, a catastrophic lawsuit, or even government seizure. So he created a legally separate entity to hold his most valuable, clean assets. A lifeboat in case the main ship went down. "But why use my name?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why not an anonymous offshore account?" "Because that's the genius of it," Sarah chimed in, her eyes shining with a lawyer's admiration for a clever scheme. Offshore accounts attract suspicion. The IRS, the SEC, they look for those. But a domestic holding company, in the name of his wife, his quiet, non-business art historian wife, nobody would ever look there. It was the perfect hiding place right out in the open. He put his fortune in the one place he was absolutely certain no one would ever think to check. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Richard hadn't just used her name. He had used his perception of her, her passivity, her lack of interest in his business world, her trust. He had weaponized his own underestimation of her. He had built a fortress for his wealth and made her the unwitting, invisible gatekeeper. The problem remained, however. They could see the outlines of the empire, but they didn't have the keys. The bank accounts were protected by layers of security. The deeds and stock certificates were held in secure vaults. They knew the what, but not the how. To claim it, they needed someone from the inside. They needed someone who knew Richard's system, his passwords, his private bankers. And there was only one man alive who fit that description, a man whose name alone made Eleanor's stomach clench. "We have to talk to Julian Croft," Sarah said, her expression grim. "Richard's financial advisor and Amber's uncle." The name Julian Croft landed like a stone in the pit of Eleanor's stomach. For 20 years, Julian had been Richard's most trusted advisor, a quiet, meticulous man who was the architect of Richard's financial strategies. He was also Amber's uncle, the one who had introduced her to Richard in the first place, hoping to secure her a cushy internship. The idea of approaching him felt like walking into a lion's den. "He'll never help us, Sarah," Eleanor protested. "He's her family. He helped Richard build this maze. Why would he help us dismantle it? Because he's a professional," Sarah countered. "His loyalty was to his client, Richard. Richard is gone. His new client is Amber, who just inherited a public company. His legal duty is to that company. Vance Holdings is a separate entity. And besides," Sarah added, leaning forward, "we have nothing to lose by asking. The worst he can say is no." Reluctantly, Eleanor agreed. Sarah made the call, framing it as a procedural inquiry regarding some outstanding paperwork from the divorce. Julian Croft, ever the professional, agreed to a meeting. They met not in a corporate boardroom, but in a quiet, old-fashioned coffee shop in Greenwich Village. Julian Croft was in his late 60s, with thinning grey hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a somber suit that seemed to be his uniform. He looked more like a history professor than a high finance wizard. He listened patiently as Sarah laid out their findings, presenting him with copies of the documents Eleanor had signed, the incorporation papers for Vance Holdings, and the transaction records they had managed to uncover. Throughout her presentation, his face remained an impassive, unreadable mask. When Sarah finished, he took a slow sip of his black coffee. He placed the cup down carefully, his gaze shifting from the documents to Eleanor. For the first time, he looked directly at her, and she saw not hostility, but a deep, weary resignation. "I wondered when you might figure this out," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Or if you ever would." Eleanor and Sarah exchanged a stunned glance. "You knew," Eleanor whispered. "Mrs. Sterling." "Eleanor," he corrected himself. "I didn't just know. I helped him set it up. It was my idea initially, the asset protection strategy. It was standard practice for a man of his wealth and appetites." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Richard's weakness was his arrogance. He believed he could control everything and everyone. He created Vance Holdings as his ultimate safety net. He put it in your name because he believed you were the safest variable in his life. Predictable, uncurious, pliable. Each word was a confirmation of her deepest insecurities, yet coming from him it sounded less like an insult and more like a diagnosis. "Why are you telling us this?" Sarah asked, cutting to the chase. Julian Croft looked out the window for a long moment, watching the city rush by. "I have a niece," he began, his voice laced with a bitterness that surprised them both. "I watched her grow up. I saw the ambition in her, the same ruthless, empty ambition I saw in Richard. I introduced them thinking a man like Richard could temper her, give her direction. Instead, they amplified the worst in each other. He fed her greed and she fed his ego. He turned back to them, his eyes filled with a profound disappointment. I spent 20 years helping Richard Sterling build an empire. I watched him become a titan, and I watched him become a monster. I watched how he treated you, Eleanor. The quiet dismissals, the public slights. You carried yourself with a dignity he never deserved. He slid a single key and a small folded piece of paper across the table. I have no love for what my niece has become. She has inherited a public persona, an over-leveraged company, and a mountain of headaches. That is Richard's legacy to her. But his real genius, his real fortune, he entrusted that to you even if he did it for all the wrong reasons. Eleanor looked down at the key. It was a simple brass key for a safe deposit box. On the paper was an address for a private vault in Midtown and a long string of numbers and letters. "What is this?" she asked. "That, Julian said, is the master ledger." Richard was meticulous. He kept a hard copy of every transaction, every account number, every password, every deed, every certificate related to the Vance entities. He kept it off-site, away from any server that could be hacked. That key and that code will give you access. It is the constitution of his secret kingdom. He stood up, placing a $20 bill on the table. My professional obligation was to Richard Sterling. He is dead. My familial obligation is to a woman I no longer respect. But my moral obligation, I believe that lies here. He gave Eleanor a final, solemn nod. He underestimated you, Eleanor. It was his greatest and his last mistake. I hope you use it to build something better than he ever could. And with that, Julian Croft walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Eleanor and Sarah staring at the small brass key that had the power to change everything. The journey to the private vault in Midtown felt like a descent into another world. Above on 47th Street, the city was a chaotic symphony of honking cabs, shouting vendors, and the frantic energy of commerce. But once they stepped through the unmarked bronze doors of Metropolitan Secure Storage, all sound vanished, replaced by a hushed, refrigerated silence. The air was cool and still smelling of polished steel and the kind of absolute security that money and only money can buy. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the small brass key in her pocket, its serrated edges digging into her palm. Beside her, Sarah Jenkins was a picture of professional calm. Her briefcase held firmly in hand, but even she seemed to carry a new tension in her shoulders. They were acting on the word of an untrustworthy ally to chase a ghost through his final hiding place. A guard with the build of a linebacker and the expression of a statue led them through a series of security checkpoints. Fingerprint scans, retinal scans, a password that Sarah read from her phone. Each step took them deeper into the facility's core. Finally, they stood before a wall of gleaming steel doors, a silent, intimidating grid of secrets. The guard pointed to a small drawer. 2 keys are required to open the box, ours and yours. He inserted a long, institutional-looking key into a lock. He then stepped back, indicating the second lock with a nod. With a trembling hand, Eleanor inserted the brass key Julian Croft had given her. It felt impossibly small, almost frivolous against the massive steel door. She turned it. A solid, satisfying thunk echoed in the silent chamber. The guard pulled the heavy door open, revealing a long, steel-lined box. "The private viewing room is down the hall," he said, his voice a monotone drone. Together, Eleanor and Sarah carried the box its weight, surprising and significant. It felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with the secrets of a man Eleanor had thought she knew. Inside the viewing room, a small, featureless space with a single steel table and 2 chairs. They set the box down. The silence was absolute. Eleanor's hands hesitated over the latch. "What do you think is in here, Sarah?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Gold-bearer bonds. Things I can't even imagine." "I don't know." Sarah admitted, her lawyerly composure momentarily slipping. "But with Richard, I've learned to expect the meticulously organized and the monumentally arrogant." Eleanor took a deep breath and opened the box. There was no gleam of gold, no stacks of cash. Instead, there were 2 items. The first was a single thick leather-bound ledger, the color of dried blood. The second was a small encrypted hard drive. Eleanor ran a finger over the worn leather cover of the ledger. There was no title, no label, just the faint indentation of years of pressure from Richard's hand. It was the physical embodiment of his secret life. She opened it to the first page. There, in Richard's precise, aggressive handwriting, was the heading Vance Holdings, Inc., Asset Acquisitions. The first entry was dated 15 years ago. It detailed the cash purchase of a commercial building on Rodeo Drive for a price that made Eleanor gasp. Page after page, they saw it all. Meticulous entries detailing dates, prices, holding companies, and account numbers. A flowing chronological record of the secret siphoning of a fortune. They didn't speak for nearly an hour. The only sound, the soft rustle of the thick paper as Eleanor turned each page. She saw the purchase of the Monet she had so admired at a gala. The one Richard had breezily told her was a new acquisition for the corporate collection. Here in his own hand was the truth, purchased via the Vance Trust, transferred to Geneva Free Port Storage. She saw the stock purchases, thousands of shares of blue-chip companies bought in her name through EV investments. She saw entries for cars, jewelry, even a private villa on Lake Como. She never knew existed. It was an empire built in stealth, a financial masterpiece of concealment. And every transaction, every acquisition, was legally tied to her name. By the time they reached the final entry, dated just a week before Richard's death, the sheer scale of his deception had left them breathless. Back in Sarah's office, they plugged the encrypted hard drive into Peterson's secure laptop. Armed with the master password from the ledger's inside cover, the drive unlocked, revealing spreadsheets that mirrored the ledger's contents, but with updated real-time valuations. Peterson, the grizzled forensic accountant, let out a low whistle. "My God," he murmured, his fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing, verifying, and tallying. "This is a work of art. Look at this real estate portfolio. No leverage, no mortgages, just pure, unadulterated cash flow. And this stock portfolio. It's a dream. Not a single margin loan against it." He projected the main spreadsheet onto the large monitor on the wall. The numbers glowed in the dimming afternoon light. The neat columns and staggering figures represented the true essence of Richard Sterling. The public-facing company he had left to Amber was his war machine, loud, powerful, but heavily armed with debt and obligations. This hidden portfolio was his crown, silent, perfect, and untouchable. Finally, after another hour of intense work, Peterson leaned back, his face a mixture of professional awe and disbelief. "Okay," he said, his voice heavy. "I have a final conservative valuation." Eleanor and Sarah waited, their hands clasped on the table. "As we know," Peterson began, standing and walking to the monitor. "Sterling Properties, the company Ms. Croft inherited, has a net asset value of approximately $950 million once you factor in its colossal debt. It's a massive, complex, and high-risk entity. He pointed a laser at the spreadsheet on the wall. These assets, however, the real estate, the stocks, the bonds, the art, the physical commodities all legally held under the Vance umbrella of companies are the exact opposite. They are stable, unleveraged, and pure. And their combined current market value is— He paused, letting the moment hang in the air. $2.8 billion. The figure 2,000 tons, 800,000 £1,000, seemed to suck the very air from the room. Eleanor felt a wave of vertigo gripping the table to steady herself. It wasn't joy or triumph she felt, but a profound, soul-crushing shock. The will, the $10,000, she whispered, was the greatest head fake in history. Sarah finished for her, her voice tight with fury on Eleanor's behalf. This was his ultimate plan, Eleanor. Don't you see, it wasn't enough to divorce you and humiliate you. He constructed this entire secret empire in your name, using the powers of attorney you signed, believing you'd never look. His plan was to finalize the divorce, cast you aside, and then at his own pace use those same documents to transfer all of this into a new trust for himself. He was going to steal your own fortune from you, and you never would have even known you had it. The full monstrous weight of his arrogance, of his breathtaking condescension, finally crashed down on Eleanor. He hadn't just hidden his fortune in her name. He had made her the unwitting temporary guardian of his true legacy. He saw her as nothing more than a secure, silent vault. And his only miscalculation, the one fatal flaw in his perfect, brilliant plan, was the simple, unpredictable fact of his own mortality. He had successfully moved every piece into place for the checkmate, but had died before he could declare it. And in doing so, he had left the board, the game, and the entire kingdom to the one player he had never even considered an opponent. The reckoning did not begin with a cannon blast, but with the quiet, relentless turning of legal gears. In Sarah Jenkins' office, the days that followed the discovery of the ledger were a blur of focused intensity. They were no longer searching for a ghost. They were methodically dismantling a fortress. Sarah Peterson and a small, hand-picked team of specialists worked with the precision of surgeons. Change of control notifications drafted with ironclad legal language and supported by notarized copies from the ledger were dispatched via secure courier to a dozen different financial institutions across the globe. Each document was a legal torpedo, silent and unseen, streaking toward the hull of Amber Croft's inherited empire. The first impact struck on a Tuesday. Amber was in a private viewing room at a NetJets facility, the scent of new leather and jet fuel intoxicating her. She had decided Sterling Properties needed a new G650. It was a statement, a way of announcing that the Queen was firmly on the throne. When the sales executive returned, his face was pale, his professional smile strained. "There appears to be an issue with the wire transfer, Ms. Croft," he stammered. "The funds from the Geneva account. They've been blocked." Amber laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Blocked? Don't be ridiculous. There are over $200 million in that account. Try again. Tell them who I am." "We have Ms. Croft," the executive said, sweating under his collar. "The bank was very clear. They said there is a new sole signatory on the account. An Eleanor Vance." The name hung in the air, a foul odor in the pristine room. Amber's smile vanished. Confusion, then fury, contorted her features. She spent the next hour on her phone, her voice escalating from imperious commands to shrill, desperate threats. The answer from every banker was the same polite, unyielding, and legally absolute. Her access was gone. Her panic-stricken call to Marcus Thorne set the next stage in motion. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, was initially dismissive. He assumed it was a minor legal snarl, a loose end from the divorce. Then the official notification from Sarah Jenkins's law firm arrived. It wasn't a rambling letter. It was a crisp 100-page document with exhibits. As Thorne read, his professional curiosity turned to disbelief and then to a cold, sinking dread. He wasn't looking at a frivolous claim. He was looking at a masterpiece of asset concealment that had just catastrophically backfired on his late client. He recognized the legal structures. He understood the implications. Richard Sterling, the master of the game, had been checkmated by a ghost. Thorne requested the emergency meeting. Sarah agreed, setting the time and place. The home field advantage was theirs. The atmosphere in Sarah Jenkins' conference room was a study in contrasts. It was a practical working space. Law books lined the walls. A whiteboard still held faint traces of their investigation, and the coffee was strong. It was a world away from the opulent mahogany-paneled rooms where Richard Sterling had made his deals. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. She wore a simple navy blue dress. There was no jewelry, save for her late mother's simple gold watch. She looked not like a billionaire, but like a woman comfortable in her own skin for the first time in decades. Her calm was a placid lake, and Amber, when she stormed in, was a tempest. "What is the meaning of this?" Amber demanded, skipping any pretense of civility. She was flanked by Marcus Thorne, whose face was a grim, unreadable mask. "This is harassment. It's an illegal asset seizure, and I will have you both disbarred and thrown in jail." Sarah Jenkins simply gestured to the chairs opposite them. "Please have a seat. I assure you everything we have done is perfectly legal." Peterson, the forensic accountant, sat silently to Sarah's right, a stack of files in front of him. "Let's not waste time with theatrics, Ms. Croft." Sarah began, her tone even and professional. 15 years ago, Richard Sterling, with the assistance of his financial advisor, established a holding company in Delaware. It was called Vance Holdings, Inc. "Here," she said, sliding a document across the polished table, "is a copy of the incorporation certificate. As you can see, the sole director and officer listed is Eleanor Vance Sterling." Thorne picked it up, his eyes scanning the page with the speed of long practice. He said nothing. "Over the next decade and a half," Sarah continued, "Mr. Sterling used this entity and several others under its umbrella to acquire a number of, shall we say, pristine assets." She nodded to Peterson. He placed a second file on the table. Exhibit A. The deed to the commercial property at 451 Rodeo Drive, Beverly Hills. Purchased for cash. Title is held by Vance Real Estate, a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Holdings. He placed another file on top of it. Exhibit B, the portfolio statement from Goldman Sachs for EV Investments. Current market value, as of this morning, is approximately $872 million. The account owner is listed as Eleanor Vance. File after file landed on the table. The deed to the villa on Lake Como, the ownership certificate for the sterling blue diamond, a detailed inventory of the art collection purchased through the Vance Trust. Each document was a hammer blow, cracking the foundation of Amber's inherited world. Amber stared, her breath coming in ragged bursts. It's a forgery. It's all fake. Richard would never." "He loved me. He left everything to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through Amber's hysteria. "He left you sterling properties, Amber. I heard the will, just as you did. He was very specific. He left you the company, the brand, the public-facing empire. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with Amber's. Did he ever tell you about the company's debt load? The bond covenants, the personal guarantees he made that are now tied to the corporate assets? He left you a very complicated, very leveraged, and very public job. You wanted to be queen. Well, he gave you the crown. It's just much, much heavier than you imagined. Marcus Thorne finally spoke, his voice raspy. My client's intention. Intention is a sentiment, Marcus, Sarah interjected smoothly, not a legal title. Richard Sterling's intention was to hide his most valuable assets from any potential creditor litigant or market collapse. And he chose to hide them behind the one person he believed would never look, his quiet wife. He used her name, her signature, and her trust to build a financial fortress. This is a scheme, a fraud, Amber yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. You were in on it. Eleanor offered a sad, tired smile. No, that was his greatest mistake. I wasn't in on it. I knew nothing. And he was so certain of that, so confident in his underestimation of me, that he never bothered to protect himself from his own death. He planned, I'm sure, to take it all back at his leisure. But he ran out of time, so the assets remain with their legal owner. Me. Peterson slid one final sheet of paper onto the center of the table. It was a summary balance sheet. At the bottom, a single number was circled in red ink. 2,814. 550,000. Amber stared at the number as if it were a serpent. The fight visibly drained from her, replaced by a grey, hollow shock. She slumped back in her chair, all the fire extinguished. She had won the battle for Richard's affection, for his public life, for his name. But she had just discovered that the entire war had been a feint. The real prize had been secretly surrendered to her enemy long before she had even arrived on the battlefield. Thorne, recognizing the legal checkmate, cleared his throat. My client will need some time to review these documents. It was the closest he would come to admitting defeat. Take all the time you need, Sarah said. The facts will remain the same. As Amber and Thorne left defeated and silent, Eleanor remained seated, looking not triumphant, but profoundly weary. The ghost of her husband, the man of immense genius and even more immense arrogance, had finally been laid to rest. The aftermath was not a life of revenge or ostentatious display. It was a quiet, deliberate reclamation. Eleanor's first act was to visit the Park Avenue penthouse one last time. Escorted by Sarah, she walked through the cold marble rooms. It was a museum of a life that was never truly hers. She didn't feel sadness or anger, only a detached sense of closure. She instructed the estate managers to liquidate everything: the apartment, the furniture, the cars. She kept nothing except a small, unremarkable painting of a Boston street scene that had belonged to her mother, which Richard had always relegated to a guest bathroom. The vast river of money that flowed from the liquidation of the Vance assets was channeled into a single, powerful entity, the Vance Foundation. Eleanor threw herself into its creation with the same passion she had once reserved for her art history studies. Her mission was clear and a direct refutation of Richard's legacy. His philanthropy had been about ego, about etching the Sterling name onto buildings. Hers would be about impact. The Vance Foundation focused on two core principles: supporting brilliant, under-recognized artists, particularly women, and funding robust art education programs in public schools. She didn't want to buy Picassos. She wanted to fund the next Picasso. Her first major project was the endowment of a new wing at the Brooklyn Museum. When the museum board asked what she wanted it to be called, she smiled. "Just call it the Contemporary Arts Wing. The art is the point, not my name." She did not move to a palace. She bought a magnificent light-filled brownstone on a tree-lined street in Carroll Gardens, a short walk from her old, tiny apartment. She spent months renovating it, not to be a showpiece, but to be a home. Bookshelves replaced gilded mirrors. A comfortable, sun-drenched studio replaced a formal, unused dining room. The walls were filled with the works of the vibrant, emerging artists her foundation was now supporting. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the will reading, Eleanor sat in her studio, the sun warming her face. Her blog, Vance's Vision, had become the official journal of her foundation, its essays read and respected by critics and curators worldwide. She was writing an article about a young sculptor from the Bronx whose work she had just acquired for a new public installation. She paused, looking out of the window at the children playing in the garden below. The sterling blue diamond had been sold to a private collector, and the proceeds had just funded an entire decade's worth of art supplies for every public school in the city. The Testarossa was gone, and in its place 100 scholarships for promising art students had been endowed. Richard had tried to value her at $10,000. He had built a secret multi-billion-dollar kingdom in her name as the ultimate act of control, but his true final legacy, she realized, was not the one he had written in his will. It was the one he had unintentionally given her the power to create. He had built his empire to hoard beauty and power for himself. She would use it to give it back to the world. And in that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by art that was alive with new ideas, Eleanor Vance finally understood the true value of $1 and of a life well lived. It was a fortune Richard Sterling, for all his genius, had never come close to possessing. Eleanor's story is a stunning testament to resilience and the extraordinary power of quiet strength. It's a story about how the person you underestimate the most can often be the one holding all the cards. Richard Sterling thought he was playing a game of chess, but he never realized his queen had a will of her own. Her journey from a humiliated wife to a philanthropic powerhouse reminds us that true wealth isn't about what you own, but about the legacy you build and the purpose you find. It's a powerful lesson in looking closer, reading the fine print of our own lives, and never ever letting anyone else define our worth. If Eleanor's incredible story of poetic justice and quiet triumph moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to take back control. And for more unforgettable real-life stories like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. What part of Eleanor's story shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below.